Are you ready, eager young space cadets?
Meep, meep.
I saw a pussy cat.
Is the limit.
Where's the kaboom? There was supposed to be an earth-shattering kaboom.
Hello, and welcome to Of Course You Realize This Means Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Graves, and it is my pleasure and privilege to bring to you the author of Anvils, Mallets, and Dynamite, the unauthorized biography of the Looney Tunes. This is a wonderful book that is on store shelves right now, and I am going to talk to the author, and we're going to dive deep into the history and the facts and what makes these shorts so wonderful and stand the test of time. Please welcome Jaime Weinman to the podcast. Hi, Jaime. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. It is my pleasure to have you on and talk about these wonderful shorts and your book, which is one of the best resources I've ever read on the subject. You go in depth in so many little facets of Warner Brothers animation and the start of Termite Terrace, the history, the creatives, all of the wonderful business of the shorts, of the cartoons, and what made that such a huge legacy to uphold. And I feel that they're upholding it right now in a really great way. But let's start from the beginning. This book starts with the premise of why are the Looney Tunes funny? The theme of this book is so captivating. What made you start there, and what was it like to dive into this subject?
Well, one reason I wanted to start with the question of what makes them funny is just the mystery of it. Why is it that these cartoons have held up so well over so many years, to the point that when we were children, we would watch them and not care how old they were and find them just as funny as they were when they first came out. With a lot of comedy, you sort of have to put yourself in the right frame of mind, or tell people to get into it or overlook the different style. And there are some types of comedy that seem to require almost no work at all to enjoy, and the classic Looney Tunes are among them. And also, I wanted to start the book with something that was fun rather than starting at the very beginning, because it took, of course, it took the Warner Brothers Cartoon Studio quite a long time to arrive at their style. So I thought it would be better to start with the question of what makes Looney Tunes funny, and talking about a classic Looney Tunes cartoon like a Tweety's first cartoon, A Tale of Two Kitties, and then go into Bosco and harmonizing and all the growing pains that it took for 10 years to get to what we think of as the Looney Tunes comedy style.
Yeah, and I love how you do that. You integrate the anatomy of a cartoon in multiple sections of this book. So that way we get a break from just the history, and you go into a short and you just document everything that makes this short work and why it's funny. It just answers that question time and time again. And I love your perspective on these shorts. And you just mentioned A Tale of Two Kitties. That's one of the ones that is a parody short. So it took Abbott and Costello and that whole formula. It created who we know as Tweety Bird and these two other cats that are trying to get Tweety Bird out of his nest and have him for lunch. And they call them Babbitt and Catstello. Yeah. And you mentioned something I've never heard before, which is the Weird Al effect. Do you care to explain that?
I got it from TV tropes, I think. So the Weird Al effect is when the parody outlives the original. So people who listened to Weird Al Yankovic or some other song parodist might not be familiar with the song they're parodying, because maybe it was only popular for a year or two, and so they will know the parody better than the original. And that happened a lot with Looney Tunes because the writers and directors of the cartoons leaned very heavily on borrowing from other comedy, and particularly radio comedy and later television comedy. And some of the things they are parodying remained well known for a long time. Abbott and Costello, I think, are still quite well known. Other things are not so well known. So Tweety is one of several characters who's sort of based on this character from the Red Skelton show, the Mean Little Kid, who's this kid who does horrible things while talking baby talk about how cute he is. And that's where the contradiction comes in. This horrible person who's pretending to be a cute little innocent. And of course, Red Skelton, I think, is only a name now, and his radio show is largely forgotten, but cartoons were constantly ripping off his radio show. I don't really know why. And so that's the effect of something that becomes funny completely detached from its parody source. And we don't, as people will testify, you don't really need to know Baby Snooks or Duffy's Tavern or any of the many things that are turned into Warner Brothers cartoons, as long as you have the basic premise that makes sense, which is cats trying to eat bird. It doesn't really matter if you know who the cats and the bird are based on.
Yeah, and that is such a really great way to put it. I am a huge Weird Al fan, and I never realized how many of his songs that stick with me, even far beyond the originals. And I love the fact that you were able to find that comparison, and it works so well. I feel like the Looney Tunes do stand on their own beyond their source material or what inspired the comedy behind it. So absolutely, that is such a great find in your research. And the fact that Tweety is celebrating his 80th anniversary and he's still as popular as he's ever been is remarkable to me. I also love how, and Tweety is one of those characters that, while he did go through changes and evolutions over time, he pretty much stayed the same from whenever he was first introduced into the franchise. And I just, time and time again, the Looney Tunes have shown us that great characters can come out of either parody or, originality in their final, or in close to their final form in their first appearance, which is just incredible. And Tweety's one of those.
In Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Tweety's appearance involves him doing a gag he did in his very first cartoon, A Tale of Two Kitties, where someone is hanging by a wire by their fingers from a wire, and Tweety picks out, detaches one finger after another by saying, this little piggy went to market, this little piggy stayed home, and so on until the poor sap falls to the ground.
Right,
and that was sort of in some ways getting him back to the rougher roots he had in his original cartoon, because he did, as time went on, become a little nicer and a little more genuinely innocent. But it also showed that you could that how fully formed he was with that, with a gag that could be repeated many years later, and everyone would think it was in character for Tweety. Of course, his catchphrase, I taught, putty tat, is completely intact in his first appearance. So there were changes, but what we see in Warner Brothers cartoons is that if something catches on with the audience, if it got a laugh from theater goers, they would keep doing it and doing it. And so we will often see something from the very first cartoon that catches on, and then they just keep doing it until they're told to stop.
Thankfully so. Because those gags do still work. And yeah, it's intrinsic to his legacy that he says, I taught putty tat, and that he had those specific gags, whether it be the wire hanging gag and taking the fingers off, or pulling a mallet out from underneath nothing. He's just, he's just super great with the gag work and with the characterization that they gave him. And I it's indelible. I just love this character so much. Another character I love so much is Bugs Bunny, and we haven't talked about him yet. And he's a big part of your book. I believe he has a couple of. Obviously, you have these anatomy of a cartoon segments, so he has one of those, and then also there's a section, an entire chapter devoted to Bugs Bunny, and he pops up, again and again, as he should, and so he's had a numerous amount of artists tackle the antics, tackle the personality. Who would you say had the biggest input as far as making him the lead of the Looney Tunes?
I would definitely say Tex Avery. As my chapter on Bugs, the evolution of Bugs goes into, the creation of Bugs Bunny was sort of a collective effort on the part of the studio. Many different directors handled this character, this rabbit character that they wanted to make into their new star. And so you have Ben Hardaway, who directed his first sort of prototype appearance, Porky's Hare Hunt, and his nickname Bugs eventually attached to the character because he was known as Bugs' Bunny. And you have other directors who made cartoons with something like Bugs. Chuck Jones made a couple of cartoons with the sort of prototype Bugs and Elmer Fudd. And then out of all these cartoons, Tex Avery was then made a Wild Hare in 1940, which introduced a number of. It used the same rabbit and also Elmer Fudd, and in hunting, in the basic plot of Elmer goes out hunting, meets this rabbit. The rabbit screws with him every possible way, and finally drives Elmer crazy. So what Avery did was he took everything that had been done with these characters up to that point and coalesced them into something that could be a viable formula. So his version of Bugs introduced sort of something close to, though not quite exactly, the final design. It was the cartoon where Mel Blanc decided finally this hit on the voice he should have and the accent he should have, the famous New York accent that you can't quite place in any part of New York. So he would say, Mel Blanc would say that it's a combination of Brooklyn and the Bronx, and it was, of course, the cartoon that introduced "What's Up, Doc," which is, I think, pretty well known to be Tex Avery's idea. He would sometimes use the term "doc" in other contexts in his cartoons, and he claimed it was just something people had said to each other back in Texas. And everything about that cartoon is the prototype for every other Bugs Bunny cartoon to come. So much so that 10 years later, when Chuck Jones made the first cartoon teaming up Bugs and Daffy, it starts out with Elmer Fudd hunting in exactly the same way as in a Wild Hare, saying the same line to the audience: "Shh, be very quiet. I'm hunting rabbits." And Carl Stalling, the composer, even uses the exact same music he used in that scene in a Wild Hare. That's almost the closest thing you get to a continuity reference in Warner Brothers cartoons, because everyone, to a certain extent, every Bugs Bunny cartoon after 1940 is sort of a remake of a Wild Hare. It's that. So Tex Avery was not the sole creator of Bugs Bunny. Everyone contributed, and everybody got a lot less money for their effort than they should have been entitled to. But if there is someone who made Bugs what he is, it's Tex Avery, who I think is I don't use the term genius lightly. So of all the Warner Brothers cartoons cartoon directors are skilled. Some of them are really great, but I think Tex Avery is sort of the visionary, the one who saw something other people couldn't see and taught everyone how to see things his way. And so even though he left the studio quite early, his stamp is all over the studio until the end of time.
Absolutely. And so much so that there's even a reference to Tex Avery in the Looney Tunes cartoon shorts, which debuted in 2020. And there's a cement gag where Porky's trying to build a statue in using cement, and the statue comes up as Daffy's pranking him as Tex Avery holding Daffy's hand, which is an homage to Walt Disney at Disneyland, holding Mickey's hand. And they couldn't have chose a better founder for that character, or for any of the characters.
Yeah, the only other alternative would be Leon Schlesinger, and I don't think who the producer, and I don't think even he would. I don't think he would have, considered himself to be a creative contributor the way Walt Disney was. He was just the producer by everyone. He was not a creative producer. So people were not looking to Leon Schlesinger to learn what they should, kind of cartoon that they should be making, but instead Chuck Jones and Bob Clampett, who both worked for Avery as animators, looked to him to for their idea of what a cartoon should be.
I'm a huge fan of Tex Avery, and I followed his career after Looney Tunes, the short-lived career of Looney Tunes with him involved, and then over at MGM, whenever he did the Tom and Jerry's and his own spin on things. And
yeah, I mean, he didn't create Tom and Jerry either, but again, like Hanna and Barbera, who did do the Tom and Jerry, they were openly influenced by his work, and they were very clear that he taught them a lot of what they knew about how to be more violent and funnier.
We could all be more violent and funnier. So another director and somebody that was definitely in the departments over at Warner Brothers during this time was Robert Mckimson. He also directed a handful of Bugs Bunny shorts, but he also was instrumental in pairing Foghorn Leghorn with Barnyard Dog and Henry Hawk and creating these rivalries. Can you speak on this, and which other rivals illustrate a character's relationship in the franchise?
I think Foghorn Leghorn is a bit unique because it was originally intended as more of a hunting idea with the chicken hawk trying to catch chicken, but it was so convoluted that this tiny chicken hawk trying to catch an enormous chicken, larger than a man, that eventually it turned into more of a rivalry thing. So it started to play up. Henry was phased out or became less of a threat, and it became more about the rivalry between Foghorn Leghorn and the dog, and the pranks they play on each other and the mind games they play on each other, and just their attempts to, I guess, find something to lighten up their boring lives as farmyard animals. So the Foghorn Leghorn cartoons, which I talked about in a whole chapter, because I know that Foghorn Leghorn is very popular but hasn't been that much covered in books about animation. It's a little more sitcom-y, I think, than the other Warner Brothers series, because you will notice that Bugs or Daffy or Porky can live at any time, in any place, anywhere, and there aren't a lot of cartoons like that with Foghorn Leghorn changing the setting. He's almost always on a farm, and having that rivalry with the dog. And so it was, I think, in some ways, an attempt to take some of the formula of sitcom, which of course, radio had popularized, and apply it to cartoons. This idea that you have two or more characters in the same place every time, playing out these endless rivalries and petty bickering and one-upmanship. And there are a few other Warner Brothers series that go into this a bit, like obviously the three cartoons with Bugs, Daffy, and Elmer create this dynamic with Bugs and Daffy, who aren't really trying to kill each other, or although they don't mind killing each other, but they're just sort of friendly rivals who are trying to one up each other. But I think that's a bit different from the standard Warner Brothers plot, which is character A wants to eat or shoot or shoot and eat character B. So so I think that's what gives the Foghorn Leghorn series some of its popularity. I think it's just a little different. It's just different enough from the other cartoons that if once you got used to it as a kid, you sort of looked forward to it as a break, or as a change of pace. It helped give variety to these half-hour or hour-long cartoon television compilations of cartoons that, frankly, were not meant to be watched more than one at a time.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was also thinking of a couple Sylvester cartoons that he had a rivalry with another alley cat as they were trying to capture Tweety. And
Yes.
that entire formula was just transposed into the city.
That's, that was a favorite plot of Warren Foster, who was the writer who created Tweety with director Bob Clampett. So that formula starts in Clampett's last Tweety cartoon, A Gruesome Twosome, where there are these two cats who are just spend the first 3 minutes of the cartoon just beating the crap out of each other, and then the lady cat they both want says that she'll date whichever one of them can bring her back a bird. So they spend the rest of the cartoon trying to catch Tweety, teaming up against each other, teaming with each other, and eventually, of course, getting destroyed by Tweety both at the same time. And so there are a few other cartoons that use this formula. I think most of them written by Foster. One of my favorite of all the Tweety cartoons is, and as I say in the book, it's hard to remember the titles because the titles often have nothing to do with the plot.
Yes.
It is Putty Tat Trouble, which is this cartoon, a wonderful cartoon from 1951, where sort of as a bit of variety, instead of just Sylvester chasing Tweety, Sylvester and this orange cat are both trying to chase Tweety, and that creates so much more of an interesting dynamic, because instead of Tweety hurts them, but they hurt each other, or they try to outwit each other and fail badly, and it's just I sometimes wish there had been more cartoons like that in the series, if only because it's such a welcome change of pace. But maybe the creators were smart enough to know that what makes something like that work is that it's a change of pace. So I would normally assume that Fritz Freeling and Warren Foster know more about what makes a good cartoon than I do. So it's
Totally. And speaking of a change of pace, we have an entire chapter dedicated to Daffy 2.0, which is Chuck Jones's handling of Daffy Duck and making him that rival for Bugs Bunny in the Hunter trilogy that you're referring to. What was it about this new evolution that made Daffy not succumb to the same legacy that Porky has, that he's almost forgotten?
Well, it's hard to know exactly why Daffy was changed, because there's never been really any clear data on how popular he was. He certainly was not as popular as Bugs Bunny, but he must have been somewhat popular to keep starring in his own cartoons until the 60s. But it's clear that by the late 40s, the kind of character he was created as, the bounding screwball wild man who just, who's so dangerously insane that you just have to get out of the way. That type of character was on the way out. People think of Bob Clampett as the director most associated with the crazy Daffy. But if you look at his last Daffy cartoon, and maybe his best Daffy cartoon, The Great Piggy Bank Robbery, the Duck Tracy cartoon, Daffy isn't like that at all. Even he's not not crazy. He's just a regular guy, and who dreams he's Dick Tracy. And a couple of years before that, you had Drafty Daffy, where Daffy is this horrible, cringing coward who spends the whole cartoon trying to dodge the draft and kill the little man from the draft board, which is such a subversive thing to do in the middle of World War II. But I think only Bob Clampett could have gotten away with that. But the point is that people did not want to see Daffy be a bounding wild screwy character anymore. And so what can you do with him if he's not crazy? And the answer is sort of not all that much, or at least until Chuck Jones and his writer Mike Maltese started to get the idea of with the Scarlet Pumpernickel, they hit on the idea of sort of continuing what the Dick Tracy cartoon started, and having Daffy imagine he's some kind of fictional hero, and that became the template for Drip Along Daffy, where he's a Western hero. Deduce You Say, where he's Sherlock Holmes, and then of course Robin Hood Daffy. But the other thing they did was, for the first time ever, team him up with Bugs Bunny, which is unusual. The Bugs Bunny had not usually had guest stars in his cartoons, and in fact, except for surprise cameos or little jokes, characters did not usually appear in each other's cartoons. Porky and Daffy appeared together because Daffy was created for a Porky cartoon, but that was about it. And what happened with Rabbit Fire, with the first of the hunting trilogy with Bugs, Daffy, and Elmer, is that Daffy intrudes himself into a normal Bugs and Elmer cartoon, really almost identical in setup to A Wild Hare, except that Daffy is in it. And then it becomes a matter of, instead of Bugs just outwitting Elmer, which is kind of easy to do, he outwits both Daffy and Elmer, playing on Elmer's stupidity and Daffy's tendency to get angry and not think. So the famous duck season, rabbit season thing, where Bugs plays on the fact that he knows that Daffy will always say the opposite of whatever Bugs says. So duck season, rabbit season, duck season. That's it's Daffy's just too angry and too and too excited to think about what he says. He just and that's true of most of us. I think we can identify with that because a lot of us speak without thinking. So so what happened was that this created a whole new world for Daffy to play in. Suddenly, now that he's no longer a screwball, what can he be? Well, he's the sort of the closest thing to a regular guy in cartoons. He's this guy who wants to be a success, but can never quite pull it off. He's smart, but he's not as smart as Bugs Bunny, and yet he keeps trying to outwit Bugs Bunny and failing. So Chuck Jones and Mike Maltese, but especially Jones, I think, fell in love with this idea of Daffy as this lovable failure who just exemplifies the person who would like to be Bugs Bunny but can't. And that became sort of his default characterization for a long time, even though that itself, as I say in the book, that itself eventually became stale, and that, I think, held back Daffy to a certain extent because he was never allowed to be changed again the way Chuck Jones was allowed to change him back in the 50s.
That's such a rare insight into, looking at what the past brought us, but also like what could have been if certain things were changed. And, having this podcast and going back through the classics, I'm always having those thoughts. And, like you saying that it was a really unique idea to have Bugs Bunny have this co-star in Daffy, and that changed the dynamic entirely of this character. I keep waiting for Bugs and Tweety to have their own short together. Like, what would that be? Like, how would Tweety change? And,
it's one of many things. Like, there's always been a sort of conservatism to the way the characters have been treated, certainly ever since at least the late 50s, and definitely since the original studio broke up. This thing where the character is marketed as being this, and they have to be like this forever. And that goes on even to a certain extent today. But sometimes you really need to do it to shake things up. So on Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the original scene with teaming Daffy and Donald, they asked Chuck Jones to come up with something, and it was he submitted kind of an old-fashioned, fairly standard idea about Daffy being jealous of Donald or whatever. So I think it was closer to a typical Bugs and Daffy thing. And the version that wound up in the film, which was created by other people, was something that was a bit I guess closer to Daffy's crazy roots without being without being a pastiche of that. It was funnier because it was something we hadn't seen Daffy do in a long time, and and I think the question about any of these characters is, can we surprise the audience? Can we give them something they haven't seen in a while? And that was what that scene did for Daffy. But I think too few scenes have been able to do for the character.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. And I wish that there was, more time with the original creators and these characters. I wish there was more time with them. But, that will be lost to history, as we know how that happened and they had to go their separate ways. This book, though, documents some of the best moments of those years. And you have these archival sketches in between the book, and the sketches instantly sent me to either the shorts that they are representing, or just looking at this raw penmanship of what a bug sketch was like, for Bully for Bugs. And you have so many great choices in here. And what about those sketches were nostalgic to you, or which ones stood out to you of oh, that's going in my book? Oh, that's so cool.
Well, I really love the Yosemite Sam one because it's one of those ones where I know exactly which cartoon it's from and which animator it's from. It's from a cartoon called Wild and Woolly Hair from 1959, and it looks like it's, at least some of the drawings at least look like the style of Virgil Ross, who was one of the top animators at the studio for many, many years. He animated On a Wild Hair for Tex Avery. And then he animated for Bob Clampett, and then for Friz Freleng almost to the end of the studio. So, and I don't talk a lot about this in the book because I'm not as good at other people as at identifying animators' individual styles, but part of the fun of watching the cartoons is being aware that the characters do change from shot to shot because different animators take over and they have their own styles. That's something that I think is very special to the hand-drawn kind of animation, because while obviously CGI animators have their own personal styles too, the actual drawing of the character cannot change quite as much as it does in hand drawn. So seeing, oh yeah, that's Chuck Jones's drawing, or that's or that's Virgil Ross, or that's Holly Pratt, or whoever. It just makes me feel like I'm communing with that artist, or these drawings were created by people who are like most people dead now, but they live again through these drawings, and that's that's part of the magic of art.
Absolutely, it is so magical because these illustrations just take you back to the first time you saw it, and it's so raw, but also so wonderful. And we have so many creators to thank, but especially Friz Freleng, who had this gift for softening abrasive characters, as demonstrated with Tweety, and taken from Bob Clampett, and given to I want to say Granny, because I think it was Friz Freleng who introduced the whole Granny and Tweety dynamic.
Yes, he was. It was in 1950 where her first appearance was in a Tweety Sylvester cartoon, 1950.
Yeah. So what made him the perfect creative voice behind Speedy Gonzales?
Well, I wouldn't say necessarily the perfect, because I don't think the Speedy Gonzales series represents his very best work. Not that it's, some of the cartoons are funny, and Speedy's first cartoon won an Oscar, though that's not always proof that it's the best cartoon of the year. But what happened with Freleng by the 50s was, I think, clearly the studio's top director. He won the most Oscars. He was always the last to be laid off, and in fact, when the original studio was closed down, he just stayed on there and rebooted it as DePatie Freleng Enterprises, and continued to make cartoons on a lower budget for Warner Brothers distribution. And so what happened was that I believe there was a period when when most of the staff was laid off in the 50s, the so-called 3D shutdown, when Jack Warner shut down animation until he could figure out if they was going to have to convert all of the films to 3D. Then when they decided they wouldn't, they hired back everyone else. And but Freeling, I believe, was still there, or at least was laid off less than the others. And during this period, I think someone must have brought to his attention this character that Bob Mckimson had created in a cartoon called Cattails for Two, which was kind of similar to the setup of A Tale of Two Kitties, except that the mouse was Speedy Gonzales, the fastest mouse in all Mexico, and the cats were based on George and Lenny from John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, because that is the most popular book for any cartoon writer. As you know, the George and Lenny are just in like referred to or parodied in just about every cartoon imagiable. So,
yeah, they are.
Yeah. And anyway, so Freeling took this character, and he or someone must have realized that they could do something with him, but he was kind of a racist caricature, and also the George and Lenny thing, I think, were not very good adversaries. So Freeling and his writer Warren Foster and his designer Holly Pratt sort of went to work on this guy. They made him look really nice and handsome, gave him this beautiful suit that always made him stand out as having the best taste in clothes of any character in the cartoon, and they made him kind of a hero for oppressed Mexican mice. So the premise of that cartoon that won the Oscar is that the mice are being are trying to get into a cheese factory, which is guarded by Sylvester, the American the American border guard cat. And so they ask Speedy Gonzales to come and use his super speed to get their cheese. And just the rest of the cartoon is just Speedy trying to catch Sylvester trying to catch this mouse, and the poor guy, if he couldn't catch Tweety, how is he going to catch a mouse with super speed? I mean,
right. The odds are against him.
Yes. So what Freeling came up with there was this formula where you had, Speedy was this sort of noble hero, but with flaw, with a taste, with some flaws, like being too much of a playing around with too many women and stealing people's girlfriends and so on. But he's he's generally a guy who's on the side of justice, and that eventually made him very popular worldwide, and including famously popular in Mexico, where the dubbing presumably was a little less over the top than Mel Blanc's Mexican voices, and so. I would not say that the cartoons are free of racism by any means, but Freeling did show a sort of ability to think more like a producer than any other Warner Brothers director, and that's not really a criticism of him, but it just means that he's always thinking like, what will be the most marketable as a series? What can we do with this character that is most likely to lead to a long-running series? And so he did not make very many cartoons outside of his few long-running series, like Bugs in Yosemite Sam and Tweety and Sylvester were a huge amount of his output, because he didn't really have that much interest in non-recurring characters. And the way he dealt with Speedy sort of shows, his skill at gag timing, and his skill at coming up with a formula that would be sustainable over many cartoons. But it like every other director, it also shows some of his flaws when it's not his best. And I don't think Speedy shows him at his very best. But he certainly did come up with a winning formula, and that takes a lot of skill and talent.
Yeah, and there's a lot of love for this character even today. And in my previous podcast, I had a discussion about the history of the character and where he is now and everything. And we got into sort of the the inspirations behind that outfit, that iconic outfit, and the colors he wears, and his catchphrase, and it's a very interesting character study. Definitely has notes of racism throughout. But I feel like as we progress, I think there are new ways to tackle him if they wanted to in the new shorts. What Friz Freeling gave us is definitely in a formula all to itself. But it works. It still works. It's still funny. And as you said, it won an Oscar. So
Yeah.
it can't all be bad. But, that's not the end all be all of the best short, as you had correctly mentioned. So in the 80s, Chuck Jones, Bob Clampett, and Tex Avery inspired a slew of Hollywood directors and talent like Mel Brooks, Steven Spielberg, Joe Dante, and George Lucas. We know this as it's well documented from interviews. And Joe Dante has actually gone on to direct a Looney Tunes movie. What did the influence of the old shorts lead to in the realm of film and 90s animation that made audiences stand up and become attentive to the classics again?
Well, as I say, I think the clearest case of Looney Tunes' influence on a feature film, apart from Dante, who's almost like an honorary Looney Tunes director himself in things like Gremlins, and especially Gremlins 2. But besides that, the clearest Looney Tunes influence is Mel Brooks's Blazing Saddles, where Cleavon Little's character, the black sheriff in the racist Western town, almost becomes Bugs Bunny, literally becomes Bugs Bunny in one scene where he just does an old Bugs Bunny explosion gag and walks out to the Merry Melodies theme song. But it's also the way he gets out of his problems by trickery, by confusing people and playing on the stupidity of his opponents, is very Bugs Bunny influenced. And I think for a lot of people who grew up with his cartoons, Bugs Bunny sort of became an example of how you could have a character get out of trouble with using intelligence and wit and just understanding the psychology of his opponents, because so much of what Bugs does is based on something like he does with Daffy, which is playing on his psychology and his tendency to follow a pattern without thinking. So you can see some of Bugs Bunny probably in Indiana Jones or other characters who are who live almost more by their wits than their strength. And it's also that the chase style of classic Looney Tunes cartoons influences the way chase scenes were done in some of the movies that these people made. So in Steven Spielberg's first theatrical feature, The Sugarland Express, which is about people on the run from across the country, there's a clip from a Roadrunner cartoon as if to show a certain amount of kinship with a different kind of chase through the desert. And I think that as another thing that happened is that some of these film creators sort of became interested in meeting the people who had made the cartoons they loved when they were young, and they started to take a certain amount of interest in reviving the characters. So I think one of the biggest moments in the history of reintroducing these cartoons to an adult audience, or at least making it okay for adults to admit they liked them, was Who Framed Roger Rabbit in 1988. And of course, that was a Disney production, but Spielberg was the executive producer, and he used his clout with Warner Brothers to convince them to loan out their characters to be used in the film, and making it the only time Mickey and Bugs or Donald and Daffy ever appeared officially together in the same film. And that was a very important moment, not only because it led to things like Spielberg's Tiny Toons, which was a TV show tribute to Looney Tunes from using young cartoon characters who sort of worship the Looney Tunes characters and learn from them how to do cartoon comedy. But it also became the moment where where Looney Tunes cartoons were established as the ultimate in cartoon comedy, because even though it's a Disney film, it's very clear that it's done in the Warner Brothers cartoon style. And when they think of when Roger talks about the kind of gags that cartoon characters do, he is mostly not talking about Disney characters. It's Bugs, it's Daffy, it's it's so many of these other characters who solve their problems with violence and get play on the psychology of their opponents, and can only do something if it's funny. They can do anything if it's funny, but only if it's funny. And so that movie really, I think, turned the Looney Tunes franchise into something that was clearly not just for kids. And to some extent, it's remained that way ever since, though partly just because there are fewer outlets for children to see them.
It's such a magical time capsule, that movie, and it's definitely left its mark. I just want to thank Spielberg for, as a kid from the 90s and growing up with the revitalized Looney Tunes on TV and the Bugs Bunny and Tweety show, re-airing the shorts on ABC, Tiny Toons and Animaniacs, which have both been given a green light to be rebooted on Hulu. Animaniacs is already experiencing season 2 right now to much success, and Tiny Toons University a little bit later. I just, I love the fact that Spielberg had such a hand in bringing what we love about classic animation to a modern era. Yeah. And we're still seeing the effects of that today.
Yeah.
So that's really special. And I love that film. I love Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the Robert Zemeckis film. And I just, every time I revisit it, my heart grows a little bit more like the Grinch with the film. And yeah, it's so magical.
Yeah.
So in the 90s, keeping with that era, we had Bugs Bunny return to the big screen in Space Jam, the 1996 film, and Looney Tunes Back in Action in 2003. Why did putting the Looney Tunes back on the big screen irrevocably give the characters an inability to be themselves?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't really put it that way. I don't think the Looney Tunes characters are not themselves in the Space Jam movies. It's just impossible for it to be a Looney Tunes story that is satisfying, because the structure of these films is that the stakes are real. The plot of the original Space Jam, to the extent there is a plot, is that the Looney Tunes are doomed unless they play in this basketball game and defeat the bad guys. And the whole original franchise of Looney Tunes cartoons runs on the idea that the stakes are extremely low. So if we actually believed that characters were getting hurt and that they were in pain or that they were dying, it would not be funny. So the characters always act like getting hurt is, getting run over by a car or something is just a minor humiliation. It's just it's really just the pain of being outwitted more than it is the pain of being run over by a car. And so once you put them in this situation where they're actually afraid to die, or they're actually afraid of something that something genuinely bad is going to happen, then it kind of scrambles the stories you can tell with them, because that's just so distant from what the characters were created to be. But that's always been the problem with a Looney Tunes feature of any kind, which is that a feature has to have stakes, and a 6-minute cartoon does not. And so there's always been that problem that I think has stymied a lot of attempts to make a Looney Tunes feature film. It's just like, what can you do with these characters when their whole point in them is everything you can say about them you can say in 6 minutes? So I don't envy any writer trying to figure out a solution to that. I've had my own ideas. Like my favorite, can I just give my fantasy idea for a Bugs Bunny feature would be the cartoon 8-Ball Bunny, where he's taking a penguin, a cute little penguin, and trying to get him back to the South Pole, as just a series of vignettes that he does, that he does on the way back to the South Pole, like, meeting the Humphrey Bogart character saying, "Pardon me, can you spare? Can you help out a fellow American who's down on his luck?" And I thought that if you took, if you took the basic premise of that cartoon and just made the vignettes longer, you could have a feature film. But even then, I know, I'm still talking about a 6-minute cartoon, so I could say that people might get really bored with that plot if you stretch it out to 90 minutes. So again, it's a dilemma that I think might be solved someday, but hasn't been yet.
Yeah, and speaking of, I'm very interested in seeing what they do with the whole Roadrunner or the Wile E. Coyote court movie that they're working on, no, Wile E. Coyote versus Acme.
Yeah.
How that's that's its own debacle.
Yeah.
So we'll see how they tackle that.
Well, I mean, it's based on sort of famous New Yorker piece, I think, which is the Coyote suing Acme for, all the bad products they've, at least he claims they're bad. They would claim that he just uses them wrong. But that was, it could work because that, the funny thing is, like, it's not supposed to make sense that he can get anything that he wants from a Acme catalog, but somehow can't buy food. But if you sort of deconstruct that and literalize it, it could be sort of, unique and funny, or it could be a slog. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, he just got to sort out his priorities. Just Uber Eat it.
Most people would say he doesn't really care about eating the Roadrunner at this point. He just wants to catch him. I mean, it's just like he's not really hungry. He just won't give up.
Yeah, that's what I believe. He's very persistent. He's the embodiment of persistence.
Yeah.
The current state of Looney Tunes and their new legacy of these characters for current and older fans has a lot to offer, from the new designs that harken back to the Bob Clampett 1940s inspirations from Jim Soper, to the voice stylings of Eric Bauza, Bob Bergen, Jeff Bergman, and Candy Milo. Like, what is an important lesson the new creative teams have taken from their 40s and 50s counterparts that have been instrumental in their success currently on HBO Max, where you can watch all of these new shorts? And there's another batch of them coming out this month.
I think, one thing that's important is, as you say, that they just pick voice actors and stick with them. So Eric Bauza has been there for a while now. Bob Bergen has been doing Porky for a very long time and has essentially made the character his own. And so there was a period where Warner Brothers had a lot of trouble committing to actors for the characters, and that's really a problem. Especially when you're trying to replace someone as iconic as Mel Blanc, you have to pick a voice so people can get used to it. And so I think using a cast of actors who are have been at it for a while, I think really does help with the sound dimension of the cartoons, which is one thing I get into in the book is that even though these cartoons are a visual medium, the sound dimension is incredibly important. The timing of the synchronization of sound with image is like almost what drives so much of the comedy in these cartoons. And so the soundtracks have to be absolutely great to give the proper foundation. And the originals had Carl Stalling on music, Mel Blanc on voices, Treg Brown on sound effects, and those three elements just made sure that every cartoon felt like a Warner Brothers cartoon, no matter what it was about or who was making it. And so I think being a little more less capricious about voice casting and more committed, I think, is helping the cartoons. Just putting more money into the cartoons and trying to have them look as much like full animation as possible is important, because you just can't do this kind of cartoon without a substantial investment. And I think it also, I think, just trying to get back to the character's roots, but not be too dogmatic about it. So there's there's certainly elements of the old school cartoon, Bob Clampett approach in the way the characters are handled, though. But it's not, it's not trying to do gross out gags or over the top gags all the time. The Tweety cartoons are a bit more in the style of the Friz Freeling cartoons. Bugs is sort of in between, his crazy or his nasty or tougher early phase and sort of the later phase where he became more suave. So it's this thing of, I think, the Looney Tunes buff can see little bits of inspiration they take from various cartoons, but they take inspiration from, I think, the whole history of the franchise, instead of just picking one approach that is the only way to approach the characters and sticking with it. So I think that when people watch these cartoons, they don't seem like they are. They sometimes may seem not quite right. Everyone has their idea of what works and what doesn't, but it doesn't feel like they're straining to be like the modern idea of a particular cartoon at a particular time. They're just sort of. It feels like watching the work of people who know a lot about the cartoons and want to share their knowledge with you and have fun doing it. So I think that there's sort of that. It feels kind of like a friendly atmosphere and something that they want you to enjoy and not just trying to rip off the past or reject it.
Yes, and Pete Brownguard over there is doing a phenomenal job of show running that and bringing his own authenticity to it, making it fresh and new, and allowing the voice talent to do what they think these characters should sound like. And Eric Bauza is really bringing his own yelling to the character, which we haven't heard from a while.
Yeah.
And Mel used to do that too,
right.
But for whatever reason, it just got lost. And then Eric brought it back.
I mean, to some extent, things get, Mel Blanc by the end of his life, could not do that kind of yelling anymore, which is why in Roger Rabbit, he does most of the cartoon Warner Brothers voices just before he died. But the late Joe Lasky did Yosemite Sam at that point because Blanc just couldn't do it. And so there was a sort of a general, almost imperceptible watering down of the characters and even the way they were performed over the years. And then it just took a while for people to bring them back because the characters just got so fixated, so fixed at a particular point, and the Warner Brothers just didn't want them to be done another way. So just the idea of having Bugs scream loudly for no reason, which is a big part of his characterization for quite a long time, just bringing it back seems a little bit revolutionary. But it's it's just there if you want to listen for it.
Yeah, and I highly recommend watching those, especially we have an embarrassment of riches as Looney Tunes fans because we can go on HBO Max and we can look at the restored classics, or we can look at this new series that's ongoing, or we could look at a number of, offshoots that happened, the new Looney Tunes cartoons, which started this formula that we have adapted into, bringing in the 40s sensibilities into it. Or the Looney Tunes show, which was like a sitcom version that kids, that grew up with, and now they're endowed to. I never really got into that version, but there's a lot of fans for it, and the more fans, the better for these characters, and they are malleable. They have the process and the ability to evolve and change, and you still find characteristics that you latch onto and you believe as that's the character I grew up with. Like that's my Bugs Bunny. And I feel like that is such a tried and true lasting approach to creating an animated character, something that you find in yourself, something reflective. And I think that's what your book does so well, is that it documents what we see in ourselves as well as what is there in the past, and how we can use that to evolve into people that admire animation in a whole new way.
Yeah, I think that the great thing about classic Looney Tunes is that they don't feel cynical. They're not they're not being made to it's for the most part to cash in on trends, even though they borrow from trends all the time. But they really are, as the creators would often say, they made them for themselves, and then they went to the theaters and listened in to see if what was working for them would work for the audiences. But you can't make a good cartoon with these characters if you're just trying to think of what the public will accept. You have to it has to start with the creator, and then it moves to what the audience finds in it that they can connect with and laugh at. But it's what can restore the characters as corporate moneymakers is if they're not expected to be corporate moneymakers. They have to be they have to be stuff that comes from from a place of love and a place of personal interest, and then that will reach a large audience.
Yes, and I hope your book reaches a large audience too. It's called Anvils, Mallets, and Dynamite, the unauthorized biography of Looney Tunes. And it's in stores now, or on Amazon if you don't want to go to a brick and mortar. And definitely look up Jaime Weinman's book. It is a really unique and fascinating perspective on the topic of Looney Tunes, on the history, and you present it in such a really interesting way that I felt compelled to keep reading and to follow along in this journey with you. And it was, it's one of my hobbies now, in going into a Barnes and Noble or going into, in any kind of rundown bookstore and looking for Looney Tunes stuff. And I haven't found a really good book like this for a really long time. I always go to the desk and ask, like, can you look up anything to do with like Mel Blanc or, Chuck Jones, and like, they don't carry those things in stores. And so the fact that your book came out this year, I feel is so, I get like kismet with, what I love about the shorts, what I love about the current franchise. You go into the in-depth nitty-gritty of, the anatomy of a cartoon, which is awesome. And then also you bring in your own perspective on the business side of things, like how, Schlesinger and everybody were like running down the studio and then left the studio, and the whole like selling of the IP to syndication and, all of that TV stuff. It was really fascinating to learn all that stuff and to bring that into my knowledge of this franchise and, where it could go. And so I love the book and I highly recommend it. It would make a wonderful Christmas present if you're out there looking for something for your Looney Tune friends or family. And so Jaime, thank you so much for being on the show with me today and talking about your wonderful work. And thank you for putting that out into the universe.
Well, thank you very much for your kind words, and I'm really glad that people are enjoying it. And I think it's good to have a book out there that is for people who love the cartoons and want to learn more about them, but aren't necessarily animation buffs or people who can tell the one animator from another, or it's just for just people who love the cartoons and enjoy them and would enjoy knowing a little more about them.
Yeah. And I love your note section, because your note section goes into even further detail of like your thought process. And one of my favorite notes, and I felt very seen by this, was you said, because of the pun names and the nature of, making the title of a short a comedy statement, if you will, as you're, going to the theater in the 40s, and you want to, you're going to see a short before a feature. They used all these pun names, and the titles are hard to remember for me, and because they have nothing to do with the plot of the cartoon we're about to watch.
Yeah. So a Bugs Bunny cartoon, try to remember which one is hair tonic, which one is hair conditioned, and which one is hair remover. You just can't. They have nothing to do with the plot. It's just like they probably had a list of all the hare and rabbit and bunny titles they could think of and just randomly assigned them to any cartoon. So it's one of those things where it's probably best to say, well, remember the one where Bugs and Daffy do this. It's I'm fine with mentioning them that way.
Me too. So your book is out in stores now. I highly recommend it. And once again, Jamie, thank you so much for being on the show. Where can people find you online?
I'm on Facebook for now only, but people I'm on LinkedIn, and people can find. I have a website, sort of a basic website at JaimeWeinman.com, so people can find some information about me there and get in touch with me.
Awesome, cool. You can follow the podcast on This Means Pod on Twitter and This Means Podcast on Facebook and Instagram. Highly recommend following me over there because I've been posting a bunch of stuff about Six Flags. They started their holiday in the park yesterday. And so I have some pictures up of that adventure over there, as well as the Fright Fest stuff that I did with Six Flags and, seeing how Looney Tunes are incorporated into the park year round. And there's also a new Multiversus. It's Warner Brothers and their game department have come together to create like a Super Smash Brothers style fighting game, which is a 2-player or multiplayer mobile app game that's going to be free for everybody. And Bugs Bunny is in that. So we have that to look forward to in the coming months. And there's so much to talk about, and I can't wait to divulge into even more Looney Tunes madness that we're going to get in the coming months. So again, Jamie, thank you so much for being on. And with that being said, that's not all, folks. Check back later for more content.